What I saw in Pompeii after dark when I snuck in, it sounds like the start of a ghost story. But what if I told you this isn't fiction? It's the confession of a young American archaeologist who made one reckless decision while traveling through Italy. He stepped into Pompeii after the gates had closed, and what he encountered that night has left him questioning reality ever since. Let me ask you something: if you were standing inside one of the world's most famous ruins, empty, silent, and untouched by tourists, would you trust your training, or your own eyes, if history suddenly began to look alive? Before we begin, a warm welcome back to our loyal viewers, and to those of you just joining us for the first time. You found a channel where real-life inspired mysteries and true encounters come alive every day. If you want to keep exploring these unforgettable stories with us, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single one. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from right now. Now, back to that night in 2014. Daniel Reed, a 27-year-old archaeology graduate from Seattle, found himself drawn toward Pompeii's ruins after dark. Trespassing in a World Heritage Site is illegal and dangerous, and he knew that. But the silence of Pompeii, the weight of 2,000 years of tragedy, pulled him in. What he discovered inside would shake both his scientific certainty and his sense of self. And this is where his story begins. Before that night in Pompeii, Daniel Reed's life was ordinary, at least on paper. He was 27 years old, fresh out of graduate school in Seattle, armed with a degree in classical archaeology. For years, he had trained himself to see the ancient world not as myth, but as evidence: stones, frescoes, coins, and burial layers. His professors praised his skeptical eye. His research rarely dealt in rumor, only in facts. But Daniel wasn't done with the past. With no job lined up, and a grant that had nearly run out, he decided to spend what little savings he had on one last journey. He called it fieldwork, but in truth it was a personal pilgrimage, a chance to step directly into the places he had studied for so long. For him, Italy wasn't just a vacation destination. It was a testing ground, where history could be touched, measured, and proven. That attitude set the stage for what would follow. Because while his training told him ruins are silent and the dead do not speak, his experience in Pompeii would push him to confront something far harder to explain. And it is here, with his scientific certainty still intact, that Daniel's story begins. By the time Daniel reached Naples, he was restless. He'd walked through ruins in Rome, spent days sweating at dig sites, and felt he had earned one last story before heading back to the States. That story began on the rooftop of a noisy hostel overlooking the Bay of Naples. The scene was a familiar one: young travelers, sunburned from long days, crowding around plastic tables, music thumping from a speaker someone had carried up the stairs. Cheap local wine passed from hand to hand, and with it came the kind of exaggerated stories only strangers ever tell: climbing peaks at night, wandering abandoned castles, breaking into forgotten towns. That's when one voice cut through the chatter. A German backpacker, brash and animated, leaned forward and said, "Pompeii is different. At night, it breathes." The rooftop went quiet. He went on, claiming that after a storm, part of the outer fence near an old gate had been left damaged, unguarded. According to him, locals avoided the area out of fear, whispering that the ash carried the memories of those who died there. "If you walk in after dark," he said, "you don't just see ruins. You see what they saw." Most laughed it off, but Daniel didn't. He had spent years training himself to separate truth from legend, and here was a chance to prove the story wrong, or to face something he couldn't explain. Then came the challenge. The traveler unfolded a creased map, circling the supposed gap in the fence. He slid it across the table and dared Daniel to go. From across the table, a young woman named Lena, quiet until then, spoke up. "You're the archaeologist. You'll know what's real." It was part encouragement, part test. And Daniel, caught between pride, skepticism, and the lure of a story no classroom could ever offer, didn't laugh it off. That rooftop dare would lead him into Pompeii under the moonlight, and into a discovery that continues to haunt him to this day. Just after 2 a.m., when the city of Naples had finally grown quiet, Daniel made his choice. Without telling anyone, he slipped out of the hostel with only a flashlight, a notebook, and his old field bag. No cameras, no audience. He wanted no witnesses if the entire challenge turned out to be nothing but a story to disprove. This decision was reckless and illegal. Trespassing on a protected heritage site is a serious offense, and nothing about what Daniel did that night should be repeated. But for him, it was a moment of pride, a chance to prove his training stronger than any superstition. The streets leading to Pompeii were deserted. Tour buses that normally filled the lots during the day stood abandoned in silence. Even the stray dogs that haunted the edges of the site had disappeared. By the time he reached the southeastern corner of the ruins, the world felt emptied of sound. At the fence, the German traveler's story proved true. A storm had twisted a section of wire loose, leaving just enough of a gap to squeeze through. Daniel crouched low, pressed his shoulder against the panel, and slipped inside. Instantly, the air changed. He later described it as cooler, heavier, as though stepping from one world into another. With every step, the sound of his boots scraped against the same grooves carved by Roman carts nearly 2,000 years ago. For the first time, Daniel realized how alone he truly was. There were no guards, no tourists, no tour guides waving flags in the moonlight. Just the silent streets of Pompeii, and the uneasy knowledge that the challenge had only just begun. Inside the broken fence, Daniel Reed stepped onto streets that had once carried thousands of Romans. The basalt stones were uneven underfoot, their grooves cut deep by carts nearly 2 millennia ago. Villas lined the silent lanes, their outlines ghostly in the moonlight. By day, these same streets overflowed with tour groups and guides raising colored flags. But at night, stripped of the noise, Pompeii was exactly what it was meant to be, a city of the dead. Daniel pressed forward, his footsteps the only sound. Until suddenly, they weren't. Another rhythm matched his own. Each time he stopped, the sound stopped too. He gripped his flashlight, bracing for a guard or worse, the echo of his own nerves. But then came a voice, quiet but certain, "So you really went through with it." From behind a colonnade, Lena emerged. The same traveler who had urged him on back at the hostel. She had followed him in, hood pulled tight, her expression unreadable. For Daniel, the unease deepened. He had planned to walk Pompeii alone, to test his own courage against silence. Now he wasn't just trespassing, he was responsible for someone else too. Together, the two of them moved deeper into the ruins, their footsteps echoing in streets that had not known life for centuries. It was an uneasy alliance, skeptic and believer, scientist and witness, both about to encounter a version of Pompeii no history book had prepared them for. As Daniel and Lena pressed deeper into Pompeii, the moonlight carried them to one of the most haunting corners of the city, the Garden of the Fugitives. Behind glass panels, the outlines of men, women, and children lay frozen in the positions they fell when Mount Vesuvius struck nearly 2,000 years ago. Daniel slowed his pace. He had studied these plaster casts in textbooks, seen photographs in journals, but standing before them at night was different. To him, they were not displays. They were a reminder that these were real people, neighbors, parents, children, who never made it out. Out of respect, he looked away. Lena, however, lingered. Her eyes stayed fixed on the figures, her breath fogging the glass as if she were trying to look beyond it, into the last moments these victims had endured. The contrast between them was stark. Daniel's training taught him to step back, to treat these figures with distance and restraint. Lena seemed drawn in, almost fascinated by their final expressions. This moment marked a quiet shift, two travelers, side by side, standing in the same place but seeing entirely different truths. For Daniel, it deepened the unease. If even this scene unsettled his resolve, what lay ahead inside Pompeii's hidden quarters would test him far more than he expected. Moments after leaving the Garden of the Fugitives, Daniel and Lena turned a corner, and froze. Before them stood a villa that, by every rule of archaeology, should not have existed in that condition. The facade was almost complete. Columns rose upright, their colors startlingly vivid, deep red and mustard yellow, pigments that should have long since faded to dust. The doorway was intact, its wooden frame unbroken, as if crafted only decades earlier, not unearthed from volcanic ash centuries after the eruption. Daniel stopped in his tracks. He had walked dozens of Roman sites, studied preservation methods, and worked excavation trenches. He knew what ruins looked like. And this wasn't one. What unsettled him most were the sensory details. The air carried the fragrance of herbs, rosemary, lavender, and something sharper, like resin from burning incense. Pompeii's ruins were dry and silent, yet here he smelled life. The stone beneath his hands felt warm, not cold. Lena whispered, "Do you recognize this place?" Daniel's reply was quiet, but firm. "No. This house, it shouldn't be here." The narrator highlights the contradiction. No excavation site in Pompeii looks like this. Not the House of the Faun, not the Villa of the Mysteries. Every ruin carries scars of collapse and centuries of decay. Yet this villa seemed untouched, preserved not as a ruin, but as a living home. For Daniel, it was the first undeniable crack in his certainty. His training told him what he saw was impossible. But standing at the threshold of a house that felt alive, his instincts told him the night had only just begun. Crossing the threshold, Daniel and Lena entered a villa that looked less like a ruin and more like a living Roman home. The atrium stretched before them, and through the open roof, the compluvium, moonlight poured straight down into the shallow pool below. The impluvium still held water. It shimmered as though it had been collected only hours earlier, not centuries ago. The walls stunned Daniel most of all. Perfectly painted frescoes rose from floor to ceiling. Their colors were bold, their lines precise. No flaking, no fading. These weren't the weary remnants he had studied in classrooms. They were intact, as though the artist had only just packed away his brushes. In the corner, a ceramic amphora stood open. Daniel approached cautiously, leaned in, and drew back in shock. The sharp tang of wine hit his nose, unmistakable and fresh. It was impossible. Archaeologists had found sealed vessels in Pompeii before, but never open containers still carrying the unmistakable scent of life. And then came the moment that froze him. Along one plastered wall, etched into the still damp surface, were 3 words in Latin. Carved clean and sharp, as if the plaster had only just set. Danius. Radi. Domum. Daniel. Come home. The words were too close to ignore. His training told him the inscription should have been ancient, weathered, incomplete. But this was recent, deliberate, and personal. The spelling twisted his name into something both Roman and familiar. For the first time that night, Daniel felt his identity bending. Was this a trick? Was someone else inside the ruins, carving his name into plaster to scare him? Or was Pompeii itself answering his presence? Lena's eyes lingered on the message, but she said nothing. Daniel gripped his notebook tightly, realizing that for all his preparation, nothing in his academic training could explain what he was seeing. His skepticism, his logic, both were unraveling under the weight of 3 impossible words. Deeper inside the villa, Daniel found a small wooden chest resting against the wall. It looked too intact, too unscarred by centuries underground. On top of it lay something he recognized immediately, a wax writing tablet, the kind Roman households used for everyday notes. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of these tablets from across the Roman world, but always charred, fragmented, or brittle with age. None ever carried markings that looked new. This one did. Etched sharply into the surface, in Latin, were the words: Semel abeisti. No light nos iterum morari. You left once. Don't make us wait again. Daniel's breath caught. This wasn't faded ink or eroded carving. The lines cut through the wax as if pressed only hours earlier. It made no sense. For an archaeologist, this was more than frightening, it was impossible. Science told him wax decays, wood rots, inscriptions erode. The preservation methods of Pompeii could explain plaster casts or charred loaves of bread, but not fresh writing sitting in an open room. His training told him this artifact could not exist. His senses told him otherwise. Lena stepped closer, her voice calm. It's waiting for you. Daniel felt panic rise. Every lesson from graduate school, every dig he had worked, told him he should be cataloging the impossibility in front of him. Instead, he could only stare, realizing that in this villa, the laws of preservation he trusted no longer applied. What he had taken as ruins now seemed to breathe with memory, memory that was calling him back. Daniel's eyes moved back to the frescoes lining the atrium. At first, they were exactly what he expected, panels painted in the Roman Third style, white backgrounds bordered with delicate red and black lines, mythological figures carefully posed. But then something changed. On the far wall, a fountain scene shimmered in the light. Painted water poured from a marble basin, a detail so vivid it almost looked in motion. Daniel blinked, and froze. Beneath the painted surface, just visible under the transparent blue strokes, was a face. The features sharpened the longer he stared, eyes open, mouth slightly parted. It wasn't a stranger. It was his own. He stepped closer, disbelief tightening in his chest. The outline was unmistakable, his jaw, his brow, even the tired lines from weeks of travel. For an archaeologist trained to document detail, there was no room for doubt. Lena's voice broke the silence. "It knows you," she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. The fresco wasn't just art. It was reflecting him back, not as a viewer, but as a subject. In that moment, he realized the house was not preserving the past. It was pulling him into it, rewriting its own memory with him inside. Every rule he trusted, preservation, excavation, documentation, collapsed under the weight of that image. Pompeii wasn't only holding on to its dead. It was reaching for the living. Daniel staggered back from the fresco, his pulse racing. And then he noticed Lena. She was no longer dressed in the hoodie and travel clothes she'd worn at the hostel. In the dim light of the atrium, her figure now appeared in a Roman stola, a flowing linen garment, her hair arranged in the style he had only ever seen in museum portraits. She looked directly at him. "You could stay," she said calmly. "This house remembers you." For a split second, Daniel wanted to believe her. The warmth of the atrium, the smell of herbs and incense, the perfection of the frescoes, all of it seemed to offer belonging, as if the villa itself was inviting him to remain inside its memory. But then another sound broke through, faint voices in the distance, calling his real name. "Daniel." Not the Roman version carved into plaster, but his own, clear and urgent. The spell shattered. The frescoes bled back into crumbling outlines. The roof that had looked intact split into shadows of collapse. What had been a living house was once again a ruin, broken and silent. Stones shifted under his feet, walls cracked, and Daniel realized the city was closing in around him. He ran. Through corridors that twisted back into rubble, across basalt streets that blurred beneath his steps, until he burst through the broken fence. There, in the glare of flashlights, 2 uniformed police officers caught him. Radios crackled, commands shouted in Italian. Daniel collapsed against the pavement, gasping for air, the ruins of Pompeii silent behind him once more. To the officers, he was just another trespasser caught in a reckless act. But to Daniel, the city had shown him something he could never explain, and nearly convinced him to stay. Daniel's night ended not in mystery, but in a hospital bed. After being pulled from the ruins, paramedics noted dehydration, exhaustion, and a mild concussion from when he had stumbled against the stone pavement. The medical explanation was straightforward, and to those around him, his condition seemed ordinary. The police, however, were less forgiving. Trespassing on a UNESCO World Heritage Site carries consequences. Daniel was fined for unlawful entry, a penalty that marked his record and served as a sharp reminder: what he had done was not just reckless, it was illegal. The narrator stresses again, the law is real, and the consequences are real. Nothing about his actions should be repeated. When questioned, Daniel told the officers a careful version of the truth. He admitted climbing the fence, admitted wandering into Pompeii after hours, but left out everything else: the intact villa, the scent of wine, the fresco that bore his face, and the Latin inscription that called him by name. Why? Because he knew how it would sound. In the cold light of day, no one would believe him. And in the official report, his extraordinary experience became nothing more than the reckless mistake of a tired young traveler. After being released from the hospital, Daniel returned to the hostel where the story had begun. The rooftop was empty now, the music long gone, but one detail stopped him cold: Lena's backpack was still there. Her belongings had been left untouched, folded neatly in her bunk. But Lena herself was nowhere to be found. The receptionist insisted she had signed in after midnight, a routine entry in the hostel's log. Yet when Daniel asked to see it, the record was smeared, the ink blurred as if written in haste or handled with damp fingers. Her name was there, but half erased, indistinct, almost as though it resisted being fixed on paper. Daniel pressed for answers, but none came. No one had seen her leave. No one remembered her checking out. To the other travelers, she was simply gone. And that left Daniel with a question more disturbing than anything he had faced inside Pompeii's ruins. Was Lena a fellow backpacker who vanished without explanation? Or had she been part of the villa itself, a fragment of memory shaped into flesh, guiding him deeper into the city's grasp? The ambiguity remains. Daniel never saw her again. And the hostel staff would later swear they remembered her face, but not her voice. For Daniel, Lena's disappearance was a puzzle he could never solve, and the final reminder that the line between the living and the remembered is far thinner than we want to believe. Days later, Daniel boarded a plane back to the United States. The bright cabin lights, the chatter of other travelers, and the routine of international flights felt jarringly ordinary compared to the night that still replayed in his mind. He sat with his head against the window, watching the clouds, shaken and uncertain. When friends back home asked about his trip, he gave them the safe version: the museums, the food, the ruins he had toured during the day. He spoke of his time at excavation sites, of the history he had studied, but never of what had happened after dark in Pompeii. He couldn't. Daniel knew that telling the full story would mean ridicule, questions he couldn't answer, and the risk of being dismissed as unstable. He had no proof, no photographs, no artifact to hold up as evidence. Only his memory, and the weight of an experience that defied explanation. So he carried it in silence. Outwardly, he returned to life as a young academic trying to find his footing. Inwardly, he carried the imprint of a night when a city long buried had reached out to him by name. For Daniel Reed, coming home did not mean leaving Pompeii behind. The ruins had followed him. In the months that followed, Daniel tried to move forward. He buried himself in routine, in research, in the rhythm of life back home. Outwardly, he seemed the same. But late at night, when the world around him fell quiet, something always returned. It began with a scent. Lavender, faint but unmistakable. At first, he dismissed it as memory, as imagination. Yet it came back night after night, so sharp and so real it pulled him from sleep. And with it came the dreams. Daniel found himself walking barefoot down a long corridor of mosaic stone, the tiles cool against his skin. The hallway stretched endlessly forward, lit by a pale glow he couldn't explain. Somewhere ahead, a voice called to him, not Daniel, but the name etched in plaster inside that impossible villa. Come home. Each time, he woke with the same question: had the ruins shown him a fragment of the past, or had they pulled him into a memory that still lived within their walls? Daniel Reed never returned to Pompeii. But the city, it seems, never truly let him go. And so, Daniel Reed's story ends not with answers, but with questions that linger long after the lights go out. Was Pompeii merely a ruin, or a city that still remembers those who enter its silence? Now, we'd like to hear from you. What do you believe happened that night? Was Lena real, or part of the memory of a city that refuses to rest? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. If this story left you thinking, don't leave without subscribing. Join our growing community for more real-life inspired mysteries told every single day. Click the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and be part of the discussion that never ends. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember, some stories never truly stay buried.